just come out on that. We'll find out more about that during the course of the programme. And we have two MPs who haven't quite arrived yet. There's lots of votes going on in the House of Commons tonight. I think 11 in all, and they are on number 11 now, so they will be here shortly. Thangam Debbonaire, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons and Labour MP for Bristol West, and Craig Whittaker, the Conservative MP for Calder Valley. So if you'd like to ask them a question, 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850, and don't forget you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
It feels quite empty in the studio at the moment. Alistair, you obviously have looser whipping arrangements in the Liberal Democrats.
I'm actually acting Chief Whip for the Liberal Democrats this week.
Oh dear.
So I have agreed to allow myself an early departure in order to join you.
Well, unfortunately, the other two weren't quite as persuasive. Right, let's go to our first questioner. It's Tony in Doncaster. Hello, Tony.
Hello, Ian.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
Assuming that Vladimir Putin is still in post after the war, what sort of relationship would you like to see with Russia?
Alistair.
Well, I think actually the idea that Vladimir Putin is going to remain in post after this war is one that I wouldn't necessarily buy automatically at the moment. And that's not necessarily a political judgment. That may ultimately turn out to be a commercial judgment as much as anything else, because you've seen so many big Western corporates walk away from Russia because they have been concerned about their reputational risk of staying, that I don't think they will go back while Vladimir Putin is still in post. So that's one possibility. It's difficult to see, though, what at a strategic, political level, what sort of relationship you can have with Vladimir Putin after this. Given everything he's done, given everything that we have said about him, I don't know how you easily reconstruct that relationship. But for the British people and the Russian people, it's obviously very important that we should do. But, I don't know that we necessarily make all the weather in this. It may be up to the Russian people whether Putin is still there at the end of this enterprise or not.
I suppose the other question is, even if Putin went, it's not easy to see what kind of leader would succeed him. I mean, you could actually get somebody who is even worse.
If we had this conversation 20, 30 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it possible I would say what I'm about to say, but I almost find myself hankering for the days of the Soviet Union, because I'm pretty sure that by now the Politburo would have moved against Putin and they would have taken him out for sheer reckless adventurism. But there is nobody around him. You do not have that power of structure of power. You've got an autocratic dictator at the top with very little around him, and you've seen that in the last few weeks, the reluctance of anybody to go to him and talk truth to power.
Lionel.
I have to agree. I don't see how we can have a relationship with Putin of any sort, almost regardless of the way this war wraps up. If he were to outright lose, then I don't see him remaining in power. That's the one thing that would take him out.
What does losing look like, though?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he would have to not gain any territory, including the Donbass. And, I think there's a very high likelihood that he will gain territory, and the West won't forgive him, and Ukraine won't forgive him. And I think one of the difficulties of the current sanction regime is that I can see it getting a little tighter as Putin does worse and worse things, but I don't see how it ever goes away.
Yeah. The other thing you have to bear in mind here is that this is not just a conflict or, post-conflict, a situation that will be determined by Russia on one hand and the Western alliance on the other. There's another big player, an elephant in the room here, called China. And, I could quite easily foresee a situation where China might think that it was in her strategic interest to keep a weakened Putin in a weakened Russia and keep that tension going between the West and Russia, so that China can then continue to pursue her foreign policy, which, as we know, not just her foreign policy, her domestic policy as well, has been less than benign for the last few decades.
It's interesting. I was reading this morning that China apparently believes that if Putin prevails here, it could lead to the collapse of the EU, which they seem to think would be in their interests.
I think that they see the idea of Western nations cooperating in that way as some sort of threat to them, and they see that as an opportunity to undermine it. I'm not entirely sure that I buy their analysis on this. I think, if anything,
it's wishful thinking on their part.
It's wishful thinking on their part, and I think, if anything, you will probably find that the return to a conventional ground war in Europe probably reinforces in the mind of the European Union member states, certainly the founding member states, the importance of having a European Union. And I think that I would need to see an awful lot of ifs, buts and maybes coming in before you got to the collapse. On the one, to argue against my own position for a second, let's see what happens in France come Sunday.
Well, we may come on to that a little bit later, you never know. But, Lionel, it's actually quite interesting when you look at how NATO has reacted as an organisation, you look at how the EU has reacted, there's been far more unity displayed by both organisations, and I think maybe Putin would have thought, maybe many of us would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the only happy surprises of this entire affair. I think that even the Brexit divide is softening up a little bit, perhaps domestically as well as within Europe. I mean, obviously, the UK is not the enemy. There's a bigger one.
Mm-hmm.
Let's bring in John in Barnsley. Actually, no, I want to bring in Alex in Watford, first of all, who is on the line now. Alex, what's your question, please?
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. What action should be taken if Ukraine falls?
What kind of action are you thinking about?
Well, hang on to your hats. I'm saying we've got to put a ring of steel around the borders of Ukraine and, tell Putin the game's up. You pull one boot over that border, or we're going to war.
Lionel?
It depends on what you mean by Ukraine falls. I mean, it already looks unlikely that Putin will take the entire country. It is more likely that he will partition it and gobble up more territory in the east than he controlled beforehand. And my concern is that the West would probably just end up living with that. I hate to say that, but all parties have made it very clear that they are willing to go to enormous lengths to avoid any kind of direct confrontation with Russia. My biggest problem with this on a kind of games playing level is that once the West takes that position, that Putin can do almost anything. In fact, I've reflected on the scenario whereby what if Putin did use what's called a tactical nuclear weapon, one of the smaller ones.
In Ukraine?
In Ukraine. Would, say, Joe Biden use a nuclear weapon in return? And I don't think so. And I think Putin knows that Biden wouldn't. It would look very bad from a Western perspective, ramping up the situation and raising the specter of a full-scale nuclear war, and I don't think Biden would do that. And I think that emboldens Putin to at least entertain the notion of using those kinds of weapons.
Do you have a fear, Alistair, that could happen?
Yeah, I actually caveat it by saying that I agree with Lionel. I think probably the idea of the whole of Ukraine falling now is unlikely. The annexation of some of the eastern regions, I think, is as much as Vladimir Putin can hope for, and I don't think even that is in any way guaranteed. I think, though, the questioner's proposition is one that we have to discuss, because even if Vladimir Putin did take the whole of Ukraine, my concern about the debate that we have is that we seem to say all the time, well, we can't countenance war with Russia. Now, we all understand the reasons why you say that, But if if Putin did then turn his attention to Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, which are former...
or Moldova.
Yeah, or indeed.
More likely Moldova, because it's not NATO.
Exactly.
Yeah. But, if you took Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, they are NATO members, then it's not just that do we have a question of do we or don't we? We have to. We have a treaty obligation to defend members of NATO.
But do you think it would be a good idea for NATO now to say, OK, Moldova is not a member, but this far and no further. If you invade Moldova, that's game over. We will defend Moldova.
I think the only circumstance...
Why would we defend Moldova and not Ukraine?
There is a logical inconsistency there. But the answer to that question is...
We are where we are rather than where we were.
Exactly. And perhaps we should have said that about Ukraine, but we didn't, and now we're learning the consequences. So if we keep doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome, then we are going to be sadly disappointed. But, the sort of... The attitude that you had after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, where Germany said, well, let's just quietly ignore that and let's build Nord Stream 2 so that we can import gas from Russia and bypass Ukraine altogether. Putin read the signals and he acted accordingly. So the signals that you send are important, and Moldova would be one of the most important, in my view.
John in Barnsley has sent in a text question. At such an important moment in history, is Joe Biden the right man to be leader of the free world, Lionel?
Of course not. You notice how long I hesitated. No, it's a catastrophe. Biden has, in some ways, done better than I would have expected, so, to be cheerful.
From a low bar.
Yeah. On the floor, tripping over the bar. And he's done a pretty competent job of rallying the troops, and getting Europeans to speak with one voice. And, on that level, he's done okay. I do get a little tired of his... what I would call empty, threatening rhetoric. He's always saber rattling with a pocket knife.
But he's always saying what America or NATO won't do, isn't he?
Exactly.
Which is a mistake in these situations.
And then the rest of it is all very ... And when he talks, for example, about what he would do if Putin used chemical or nuclear weapons, it's always, well, you'd be sorry. And that's has a ring of impotence about it. And the bottom line is the guy's not very scary. Half the country is constantly making fun of him for incidents like just the other day when he turns and tries to shake someone's hand, they're not there. He's ridiculed by his own people as doddering and incompetent and senile. And, as they say, that it is not a good look.
Alistair?
I'm not going to get into a lengthy defence of Joe Biden because the question is actually academic. He is the president.
Oh, by the way, I should admit I voted for him.
Yeah. Well, yes.
So this is all my fault.
I was struck when you said that he's not scary. And actually, a couple of years ago, the prospect of America being led by somebody in the White House who wasn't scary was a pretty attractive one.
Yeah, but there are people who think that this wouldn't have happened if Trump had been president.
Well,
or Trump would have just said, "Yep, go ahead, make my day."
Or you could never
say,
predict what Trump would see in any given.
I think Putin thought Trump was a fool. So I don't think that he was frightened of Trump either, but I think Trump did have the quality of being unpredictable.
Which in international affairs is sometimes an advantage, but sometimes not. Thank you, John, for that question. I'm told that they are definitely on their last vote, and the two MPs who should be sitting to my left here will be arriving imminently. Otherwise, we have the Lionel and Alistair show for the next 15 minutes.
Which isn't so bad.
It's not. I'm not saying that's bad at all. We've enjoyed the last 15 minutes and we'll enjoy the next. Keep your calls coming. 0345 6060 973. We have broken a record, though. It's the first time we've ever done 3 questions in the first quarter of the programme. So well done for that. 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Philip's
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 18 minutes past 8. Now, I was praying that our two MPs would roll up during the course of that break, but we are still waiting for them. That's Craig Whittaker and Thangam Debbonaire. With me are Lionel Shriver and Alistair Carmichael. Now, Lionel, we have plenty of time for you to plug your book. It's called Should We Stay, Should We Go? What's it about?
It's about a British couple who work for the NHS, as a matter of fact, and they are really leery of getting old and decrepit and straining the finances of the health service, and also being a burden on their family and each other, potentially. So they vow, when still in their 50s, that they will make an exit together when they've both turned 80, and then they turn 80 immediately in the book. Mm-hmm. So it sounds a little grim. It has its moments of grimness, but it's actually a parallel universe book, so that you get 12 different endings for how the couple might end up resolving this quandary. Because it's one thing to decide you want to do that when you're 52, and it's quite another to decide to do it tomorrow.
See, I think that's absolutely fascinating. How do you come up with an idea like that? Because, I mean, all good books, all good novels, they rest on the initial premise. And I've always wanted to write a novel, but I've never had a good enough idea as to what the plot should be. How do you think of these things?
Well, often it's as much as a stray remark, and that was the case in this instance, because a friend of mine in Brooklyn just announced to me with great seriousness that she had no desire to live beyond the age of 80. And I thought, well, that's interesting. What she's going to do when she actually turns 80. Is she going to act on that? Or is this going to be a lifetime resolve? Or by the time she gets to be 79, that it might turn to 81?
It's fascinating as well, because we should all be able to work this out for ourselves, but we never do. Because when I was 20, I thought somebody who was 56, which is my age now, was utterly decrepit and past it. Now I know, in fact, I'm just reaching the peak of my maturity.
Right.
Okay.
But we believe in
Dale.
But, it's that sort of, how am I going to be? And I don't think at 56 you have any better idea how you're going to be at 86 than you did at 26.
I turned 60 in July, and I have to say this is a bit of a landmark. Well, 50 meant nothing to me, but 60 really does. And
it's funny, I had exactly the same response.
Well, you can't be over 60.
I'm about to turn 65.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we'll get some advice from you after the show, but I'm thinking, well, I might have 10 years, 15 years, 20 years left. What do I want to do with those 20 years, which I've never thought about before? Is that part of the book?
I had exactly, I'm very interested in the experience of aging. It's happening, so might as well be interested in it. And I that certainly was my experience of turning 60. 50 didn't faze me in the slightest, much less 40.
Yeah.
But as soon as 60 hit, suddenly my life felt finite in a way that it never had before.
But, look, it's one of the greatest modern cliches that age is just a number. But we all have members in our own family. My parents, my mother is 88, my father is 90. My father, having been a hill farmer in the West Highlands all his life, is ridiculously fit and, could be good for any number of years yet. My mother has had a couple of bad falls recently, and, she's a lot more frail. And you realise that actually that ageing process is different for everyone. And one of the things that does now begin to cause me a bit of concern as I engage more with medical practitioners and the rest of it is the way in which many of the people who are there to care for us only look at the number. So, when my father was in hospital, we had some of these conversations about, what do we do if? Yeah. And I say, he gets every chance because he's fit and he's strong and he's completely in control of his own faculties. And doctors would keep saying to me, but he's 89. Yes, yeah. I know he's 89, but he's fit and he's strong. It's not, he's ill at the moment, but he's still he should be given every chance regardless of his age.
Well, Lionel, that is the longest book club we've ever had on Cross Question, and the effect has been that as soon as we get into a break, I'm going to order the book because I think it's absolutely fascinating. Right, I think we better get on with another question, hadn't we? Chris in Stubbington is our next caller. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ian.
Hi.
With the local elections due, could voter apathy be tackled with voting reform in the proportional voting?
So the question is, how can voter apathy be tackled? Is proportional representation, could that be a good way of doing it? Well, that's meat and drink to you, Alistair, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if you look at the experience
just say yes if
north
you like.
of the border, where we've had a single transferable vote for council elections, now this will be the third round of elections, you can see actually it has had an energising effect on local government, because councils that for years were sort of monoliths of support for the Labour Party previously are now having to find parties who will work together and, find common solutions to things. And, in communities like my own, where we don't contest elections on a party label, it has meant that you've virtually hardly ever now hear of an uncontested ward. So I think proportional representation, you would expect me to say this, proportional representation would be good for politics at all level, but I think you see the proof of the pudding of what we've had in Scotland. It has been energising and it has engaged so many more people.
I think I'm right in saying that the next London mayoral election is going to be first past the post. They've taken PR away from it.
If the government get their way on the elections bill, which is...
Oh, that hasn't... I thought that had gone through.
No, I think we're still in ping-pong with that one, as we say. So the Lords may still... But certainly that's their intention. Whether it actually makes that much difference at the end of the day, I don't know, remains to be seen, because it was not the most proportional of proportional systems, but I think it's a backward step, and I think London democracy will be the poorer for it as a consequence.
Lionel, can you get excited about PR?
No. I have to say,
Just try.
I think it's intrinsically dull. I think there's a good case for proportional representation at the local level. I think at the top of the food chain, there's a lot to be said for first past post, because it's more likely that you have a government that is capable, that has a majority, that is capable of taking decisions. Now, that said, it depends on the government as to whether or not you want them to be capable of taking decisions. So, I mean, there's a lot to be said for councils that can work together and have many voices and come to communal decisions. But certainly in European countries where the proportional representation is more commonplace, you see an awful lot of inaction, a lot of governments just completely hogtied, or what is often worse, in hock to a single party or parties that are more extreme, that because they hold the swing vote.
It's interesting your point about local government, because I've always thought that I'd be happy with PR with local government because you have these rotten boroughs at the moment. Mm-hmm. I live in one.
I live in one.
Do you?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, where you have this permanent majority of one party, which inevitably leads to complacency and at worst corruption.
And the only opposition you ever get is within party.
Exactly.
And that lacks the accountability that you need.
And I mean, in the end, though, they generally do. I mean, you will know about Glasgow, and that was a one-party state for many years under Labour, and eventually the SNP managed to chip away and get a majority. I live in Tunbridge Wells, where there's been a Conservative majority probably for 100 years, and but they've just lost it in a by-election. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in the local council elections in May. So, but like you, I have a difficulty with it for national elections, because I think the constituency link is so important, and I've yet to see a system of PR, apart from the alternative vote system, which isn't really PR, where you can maintain that proper constituency link.
Transferable vote. I have 4 councillors. And they would all say that they were my councillor. In Northern Ireland, where you have single transferable vote, people feel exactly the same.
Oh, yes. Land of unity.
Yes, indeed, but not because they elect a single transferable vote. And you know, so I think you can maintain, and you do maintain, that constituency link, albeit that it's bigger constituencies and the rest of it. It functions well.
When we had European MPs, and there was sort of
you had lists,
like 11
yes,
in a
and
constituency, nobody knew who their MEPs were,
Indeed.
did they?
And they were, for all sorts of reasons, remote. So, you know, not all systems are equal when it comes to that. But let's just challenge this idea that necessarily the idea that you get a government that, from first past the post, that is able to give you strong directions and decisions. It's not that long since somebody called Theresa May was at the head of government in this country, and you know, that was a government that was absolutely paralysed and incapable of taking decisions. That came not so long after
partly because
5
she didn't
years.
have a majority.
That came after 5 years of a coalition government, which actually did some of the really difficult heavy lifting that we needed to do after the economic crash in 2010.
I can see the
2008.
smiling faces of Thangam Debbonaire and Craig Whittaker through the glass here. So we're going to go slightly early to the LBC News with Lottie Morley at 8:29.
The Kremlin says Russia has successfully tested an intercontinental ballistic missile. President Putin says he thinks the move will make Russia's enemies think twice. The government has tabled an amendment to delay an investigation into Boris Johnson until after the Sue Gray report has been published. The Prime Minister has insisted he's getting on with the job after being fined for breaking COVID rules. And the film production company behind the movie Rust has been fined around £107,000 after cinematographer Helena Hutchins was shot dead by actor Alec Baldwin. New Mexico's workplace safety regulator says the company demonstrated plain indifference when it came to firearms on set. LBC weather, showers easing to leave a mostly dry night, a low of 2 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:32 on LBC. Welcome back to Cross Question. Craig Whittaker has joined us, Conservative MP for Calder Valley. Thangam Debbonaire, I always want to put an N. I want to say Thangnam, but I think
Please
I
don't.
did. I know. I apologise because I know I do it sometimes.
Okay.
Thangam Debbonaire, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons and Labour MP for Bristol West. Lionel Shriver is here, Spectator, columnist and author, and Alistair Carmichael, Lib Dem Home Affairs spokesperson and MP for Orkney and Shetland. You've been manfully and womanfully helping me through the last half an hour, but we now have a full panel. Before we get on to some more questions, Craig, just tell us what you've been voting on, because you've had multiple votes, haven't you?
We have indeed. We've been voting throughout the day. We've been doing Lord's amendments, ping-pongs on various things, but the last bit, of course, the big piece of legislation is the Nationality and Borders Bill, and we've just concluded 12 votes.
12, is that all? And they each take about, 10 or 15 minutes?
They do, but unfortunately the card readers that we now use in the No lobby decided they weren't working, so they had to revert back to the old system of having clerks and tick books, and of course everybody's forgotten how to do that.
Yes. Now, Thangam, there's been a bit of a development. Tony Diver in the Telegraph is reporting that Downing Street has amended tomorrow's motion so that no parliamentary investigation into claims Boris Johnson misled the Commons can begin until after the Sue Gray report. What are the implications of that?
Oh, dear Lord. I mean, all we were doing with our motion is saying that this should go to privileges, that there should be an investigation. We already know the Prime Minister has admitted, and he said so several times yesterday, amidst so-called apologies, that the thing happened, that he is supporting what the police said. So this is just trying to get to the bottom of it. And I think that this amendment to our very sensible motion, which should have given every Tory MP an opportunity just to say, if either he should be able to prove his point and do it fairly, or, we should have been allowed to have our evidence and see it. Now, they haven't learnt from the mess that they created with the Owen Paterson affair. They're trying to amend something on top of a motion when all it's trying to do is just investigate. It is extraordinary. It's a damn cheek. And I'm afraid to say that any Tory MP who votes for it is voting to cover up, because it's just kicking the whole thing further down the path.
You going to vote for it, Craig?
Well, I haven't actually seen our amendment in full yet. I've briefly glanced at it on Thangam's iPhone.
Don't tell people that.
Okay, no, I haven't. I'm lying. Oh, no, we can't say that either.
Can't say that, Craig.
Absolutely. So I haven't seen the motion yet, but what I will say is that actually I saw the Labour motion that came through this morning, and I thought it was quite straightforward and sensible. It appears that the amendment doesn't say much different. It just names the Sue Gray bit, but I don't know, because
But I mean, that seems perfectly sensible, though, doesn't it? Wait until the Sue Gray report has been published.
I mean, we've already said it doesn't have to happen straight away, that there will need to be further
So you could
steps
vote
gone
for the
through.
amendment.
Well, we want to vote for our motion, which is a sensible thing to do.
But you can vote for the motion as amended by that amendment, can't you?
My intention is that we will be voting for our motion, and obviously we're going to look at the amendment. I mean, like Craig, I've only just seen it a few minutes before I kindly allowed him to have a little look at it. So we've got work to do to see where the compromises might land. But really, what I really want to see is Tories thinking
we'll
about
edit this bit out of the podcast, because we don't want to get you into any trouble.
You say that. You say that.
I'm smiling here because I've been party to some of the discussions with Labour whips on this today,
help us
so I'm
out
not
here.
entirely sure that Thangam's determination will ultimately be realised. But we shall wait and see.
We shall.
It's yet another instance of interesting times. But the interesting thing surely is that a government that just 24 hours ago was saying we're going to vote this down, we've got a majority of 80, are now resigned to the Prime Minister's conduct being referred to the Privileges Committee.
Yes.
I don't think that's true,
He's
actually.
only just got out of Heathrow and they've already thrown him under the bus.
No, that's not true. They weren't saying yesterday at all that they would vote against it. Use that. No, they weren't. And in fact, the Prime Minister was very clear in the 1922 committee last night that he was quite keen that the House decided.
Why were there briefings this morning that would be whipped?
Well, there's loads of briefings all the time. It doesn't mean to say that it's coming from number 10 or indeed the whip's office. And, as a previous whip, as Thangam has been a whip, we know how these things work. But I can absolutely tell you that it was not said officially last night that they would whip against it.
As a former whip, you know perfectly well that this is a House matter and therefore should not be whipped. don't you? It is.
In theory.
It's not. It's a House matter.
Yeah. So that's another reason why I'm
so
not.
I invite you to vote for our motion.
I'm not saying. Well, you haven't asked me the question yet. But,
you get the chance.
but what I'm saying to you is that that hasn't come through.
Right. Should we
I mean, this all shows the unsatisfactory nature of off-record briefings and the rest of it. Yeah. But the truth of the matter is that the government has now conceded that the Prime Minister should go to the Privileges Committee. I think that's possibly the first time that has ever happened.
But by the way, I should have read this tweet out before these two arrived. It's from Charlotte, who says, "We don't need the other two. These two are brilliant."
Oh, we can.
I think we have just heard the brilliance of our two panellists here. Look, we need to go to a question. Alex is in Pimlico. Hello, Alex.
Hello, hi panel. My question is after party scandal, basically Partygate scandal, why Boris Johnson doesn't want to resign?
Craig, now, if my memory serves me correctly, you have been rather critical of the Prime Minister over the past few months. Have I got that right?
Well, the last few weeks. I mean, it's only about 2 months ago I left the Whip's office, so it is recently. I mean, the thing is, I always said that I was incredibly critical of Dominic Cummings when he went up to Barnard Castle and called for him to resign, because it was very clear. With the Prime Minister, I've always said, let's get through this Gray thing, but if it is proved that actually he has broken the rules that he created, then in my view he needs to go. And of course, was it last week? It seems like months ago now, but I think it was only last week. Of course, we found out that he got the fixed penalty notices, which
we've only had one so far, to be fair.
Well, yes, unless Craig knows something.
Well, I say S because, of course, the other person that got one, of course, was the Chancellor, and of course, the other person that I was calling to go for was the Chancellor, because I stand by what I said. You cannot make rules and then one rule for us and one rule for them.
So you have put a letter into Graham Brady, haven't you?
No, I haven't.
You haven't?
No.
Why not?
Well, as well as I do, it's a numbers game. And, read any of the press reports, probably some of them your own. There are only 10 of us that have publicly come out so far. So it's a numbers game. We need over
54
letters just to trigger a debate or a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister. And as we all know, he has a huge majority and would probably win that vote anyway. So as it currently stands, purely on a numbers basis, I've decided I'm not putting a letter in.
What would trigger you to do that? I mean, if there was a second, third, fourth, fifth, fine?
I look... this is very, very different to how it was a month ago when or 2 months ago, however long ago it was, Partygate started coming out. There just does not seem to be the force that's there to make a change. So let's concentrate on what we can change or try and change, and not be obsessed about something that actually is quite futile. And a letter at this point, in my view, would be quite futile.
Thangam, one of the sort of rules of opposition is never call for a minister to resign unless you think there's a real chance that they're going to do so. Do you really think that there is a real chance of Boris Johnson resigning?
I can't say for sure, because I don't know what's going on in his head, but I do know that he should, and that I think that some of the excuses that are being peddled by his party, by he himself, about how, he shouldn't resign, he shouldn't be kicked out in wartime. I mean, in the First World War, the Second World War, the Suez Crisis and the First Gulf War, Prime Ministers were changed, in fact, in the Second World War, twice. It's perfectly possible, and what's more, it matters even more in a time of war that you have a Prime Minister who shows that they understand the importance of the rule of law and the importance of honesty. And that's what we're not seeing at the moment. So one of the reasons why you call for someone to resign in this situation is because it's exposing the immoral vacuum, in my view, that's going on somewhere in his head or in his advisors. I don't know where it's coming from, but some part of him clearly thinks this is okay. So yes, you're absolutely right, Iain. We don't use that weapon very often, and we've used it in this case because there's simply no defence for what Boris Johnson has done. Absolutely none. And just saying there's a war on is a pitiful way of excusing propping up someone who is, in my view, morally bankrupt.
Okay. Lionel Shriver.
Okay, the other side. I am a critic of Boris Johnson on any number of fronts, but I think that for this country to lose a prime minister over a birthday party is absurd, and I think it would look absurd from the outside, and I don't think it would increase self-respect domestically. What I would rather see or have seen is for the public to be up in arms, not so much about the PM not obeying his own rules, but for passing ludicrous rules to begin with, which had very little epidemiological effect, for copying what everyone else was doing and plunging the country into repeated lockdowns that did not seriously curtail the spread of COVID-19, putting together rules that none of the if you compare countries who went into lockdown and didn't, they did the same. Okay? So most of these measures were pointless. They were certainly inconsistent. Some of them were absurd. That business of having to order a substantial meal with a drink, telling people they couldn't get together in the out of doors. There were any number of rules that were ridiculous, and that's what we should be upset about, is that we were afflicted by an absurd regime which did not really help things medically. And the people who passed those rules knew they were ridiculous and therefore broke them. But it's the fact that we were subjected to dumb rules to begin with that we should be upset about, particularly because they were not benign. They caused individuals all kinds of grief. You know, we've heard all the stories about people not being able to go to their own parents' funeral, et cetera, and caused the country enormous economic damage. This was malfeasance on an historic scale.
Alistair, it's a fair point, isn't it, that for a Prime Minister to resign over something comparatively trivial, I choose my words carefully here, rather than a complete and utter failure of policy, people would look from outside and think, well, what are the Brits doing here?
Look, we may have to learn the lessons in the longer term about what you call the failure of policy, and we will do that. But it's not just the question of the birthday party, because as we all know, there are probably going to be other instances that will be coming out in the next few weeks. And it's also about how Boris Johnson then responded to it. It was about the fact that he obfuscated and did not tell the truth. He put so many different versions of events on the record. I didn't know it was a party. We weren't having parties. Nobody told me it was a party. It just beggars belief. And that really is the problem. I think Boris Johnson, we've been at this actually since before Christmas. It started at the end of November. And if he had had the gumption at that stage to say, okay, I did a wrong thing and I really wish I hadn't, and, we're going to move on, he would have had a difficult few days, but I think he would not have been under the threat that he is now. But the problem is, the man just can't help himself. He was at it again today at Prime Minister's Questions when he said that we have record numbers of people in employment. It's not true. And we know it's not true because he previously admitted to the liaison committee that it wasn't true. He just can't help himself. And I think that...
I think what he should have said was that we have record numbers of people on the payroll, which to a lot of people would be the same thing, but it isn't.
True. But no, look, words matter. And when you've been pulled up for it once and you've admitted once that it was wrong, then to come back and say it, this is not some new backbencher who's just appeared in Parliament. This is the Prime Minister. Okay. And it matters at a time like this that we've a Prime Minister that we can trust. We've not got one.
Thangam, just respond to Lionel there, because she made some quite, I thought, telling points.
But the point was they were the rules. Now, if you say that they were the wrong rules, that's not what Boris Johnson's saying. Boris Johnson hasn't said they were the wrong rules, I regret applying them. He may come to say that, but so far he's had 18 different versions before breakfast every day of, there wasn't a party, was there a party? Yes, there was a party. No, it wasn't a party. Was there a cake? He hasn't said they were the wrong rules. He's trying to wriggle around the fact that he did break the rules. Whether or not we like the rules, they were the law of the land. He is the Prime Minister. He's not just somebody. He's the Prime Minister. They were his rules. He was on the telly box every night telling us they were the rules. He didn't say, oh, by the way, don't worry, because I've just had a party. Mm-hmm. And what he's doing now, the reason it matters is because honesty in public life really, really matters.
Right, on that bombshell, we will take a break and we'll come back with a really, really interesting question next. It's 8:47.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
It might just be me, but I think Sir Keir now has crossed the line and he's actually using personal grief too much. Just to point out, Sir Keir, the Prime Minister doesn't need reminding about COVID. He nearly died of it and his mother did die during it. So I don't know that he needs lectures about how other families have coped with that. And I say again, Boris Johnson, terrible behaviour, damn stupid, needs a good kicking, but let him back into his job. He's got plenty of things to do. Sir Keir Starmer is becoming ghoulish.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
10 to 9 on LBC. We have with us Craig Whittaker, Thangam Debbonaire, Lionel Shriver and Alistair Carmichael. Let's go to our next question. It's from Maria in Liverpool. Is Johnson doing the right thing when he more or less declares war on the Church of England? Craig Whittaker, what's he actually... I mean, just to give a bit of background to this, because, Justin Welby essentially criticised the government for the policy on refugees to Rwanda.
Yes.
And Boris Johnson today, or was it last night, apparently said that it would be nice if the Church of England concentrated their fire on Vladimir Putin rather than their own government. Right?
I don't think that's quite what he said, and I was there in the room. But he was pointing out that there was no criticism of Putin. Whether that's going to war with the Church of England, I'm not sure that is.
Well, they seem to think it is. Well, they want an apology.
Well, the Church of England should apologise to the government too, because is it ungodly to allow poor, vulnerable people in the hands of criminals and smuggling gangs be put in boats to go across the channel? No, it's not. But they're not saying that either. So, put it in perspective of what was said. It was a comment of almost like exasperation, gosh, type thing. Why isn't he criticising Putin? And that's how it was said. Of course, the press are doing what the press do today, and it's been blown out of proportion.
Well, it should be pointed out that on the day of the invasion, the Church of England did condemn it.
Yes. Yeah, but that may have been the case. But in his Easter speech, talking about
sermon,
in his sermon, in over Easter, talking about all the great and good things in the world, he didn't mention it, but he did seem to mention what the government.
Lionel Shriver, there's always this debate about whether people from whatever religion should involve themselves in politics, and Justin Welby did do that in his sermon, didn't he? But on the other hand, you could say, well, look, he is there to provide moral leadership, and if he thinks the government's doing something immoral, why shouldn't he say so?
He certainly has every right to make his views known, at the very least, as an individual. And yes, I mean, I grew up in a religious but also politically liberal household, and therefore I was accustomed to my father in a ministerial capacity making his views known and in a political context. Where I draw the line, however, is when Welby thinks that he can announce what government policies are and are not godly. One of the things that I got impatient with in the household I grew up in is that there was too smudged a line between my father and God.
Okay.
So I think that Welby can speak with moral authority as the head of the church, but I don't think he should be speaking for God.
I feel like I should be holding a confessional, but I won't. Alistair.
See me after.
Yeah, Alistair.
I don't feel qualified to pronounce in questions of godliness. I think if you address the question, though, it's exceptionally unwise for Boris Johnson to be doing this, because there is, we used to talk about the Church of England as being, was it the Tory Party?
Tory Party of Prayer. Yeah.
And those days are well and truly
gone
now. But it still speaks to a moderate, compassionate Middle England conservatism. And these are people who really held their nose to vote for Boris Johnson in 2019. And he needs to keep them as part of his coalition to keep his majority. And I think if these people are looking at the current political situation and they say, Archbishop Canterbury on the one hand or the Prime Minister on the other, who am I going to believe? I don't think many of them are going to take the side of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an unhelpful comparison for Boris Johnson himself to put himself in this position as were we going to believe Boris Johnson or Archbishop Justin Welby? Of course, we're going to look very carefully at what Justin Welby says, because he's a very thoughtful man.
Well, he is,
he's a heavyweight.
But as Craig says, he didn't mention the war in Ukraine in his Easter sermon.
In his Easter sermon. Oh, goodness, he's mentioned the war in Ukraine. He has mentioned the war in Ukraine in the most strong terms. And I think it's also really unfair, Craig. I don't think that what Justin Welby was saying was that it's right for traffickers to traffic vulnerable people. He was saying that this was not the appropriate response, and it's not, because it won't stop the traffickers. It's going to cost a fortune. It isn't practical. That. Yes, I do.
You don't.
Because you're talking about attacking the business model.
But this has never ever been done, ever.
So you don't know that either. And one thing I do know.
It kind of has in Australia.
It has.
This is not an Australian model.
One thing I do know, Craig, is that if you want to destroy the business model, you have to talk about going further back down the line. And what this is doing is assuming that the people crossing in small boats are illegal. The Home Secretary has called them illegals many, many times. She doesn't know if they're illegal.
They're going through illegal channels. But they're going through illegal channels.
Until you reach this country to claim asylum, you are not illegal. There isn't. If you use a resettlement...
No, that's not true.
Yes,
it
is.
And Afghanistan show that safe and legal routes are possible.
Perfectly
but
possible.
you have to have them in every conflict, in every region.
Well, we've got 110,000 from Hong Kong. We've done 25,000.
What about Eritrea? What about Yemen?
And that shows, so, what as Thangam says, about Eritrea, Yemen, other conflicts, and we've not provided them with safe and legal routes. But the problem with this scheme is that, according to the Rwandan government themselves, they're going to take hundreds a year, a few thousand over a 5-year period of the Memorandum of Understanding. Now, we had 28,500 people cross the English Channel in small boats last year. And to say in these circumstances, as Priti Patel does, that this is going to be some sort of deterrent effect, come on.
The proof will be in the pudding.
Well, I'm just going to add, it's even more absurd, because the Rwandans are part of the deal is that they get to send their own immigrants to Britain. So it's kind of an exchange.
We allowed 611 Rwandan citizens asylum in this country last year. That tells you a little bit about the.
We could have somebody who's wanted to seek asylum in the UK, being sent to Rwanda, being granted asylum there, and then thinking, well, I don't like their human rights. Say it's a gay Afghan who is then sent to Rwanda, thinking, hang on a minute, I don't quite like the gay laws here.
Yeah.
I'm going to apply for some asylum somewhere else. I mean, this could be a never-ending circle.
And in that way, it's as Thangam says, you don't actually break the business model.
And we all want to do that.
And yet Denmark, Thangam, is doing exactly the same thing as us.
Yes,
and
but the business model
as well.
Yes, and the business model of traffickers is still not yet broken, and we all want to break the business model of traffickers. Justin Welby does. I want to. We all do. We all share the same aim. So we need safe and legal routes,
which we have.
Which we don't have. We don't have enough of them.
Hang on.
We don't. We need family reunions.
If you want to talk about it ungodly, we've got 105,000 people in hotels in this country.
Get them out of the hotels and into homes then, Craig. That's your government. That's on you.
But where?
That's on you.
Where are the homes?
That's on you.
That's
on you. You've been in government 12 years and you haven't sorted the housing crisis.
200,000 people are offering homes to Ukrainians. Why not put some of the others in?
But that's why they've done the Homes for Ukraine deal, because we've got 105,000 people.
Most of those people are still waiting for their visas.
We've got no services for these people. The welcome they're getting to the country because the asylum system in this country is broken.
If only you hadn't been in charge of it for 12 years, Craig. Oh, goodness me.
It's broken. You broke it. But we've got people.
It's broke on your watch.
No, come on. We've got people racked and stacked in hotels because we haven't been able to move them.
I'm going to call order because we have to have a final text question. It's our fun text question at the end, which you all love. Diane in Leeds. I heard earlier that Balls could be back in Westminster. Ed Balls, I mean, running in Wakefield. If you had the pick of any MP throughout history to bring back to the Commons, who would it be? Now, there's a good one.
Wow.
I imagine, Alistair, you're going to pick Jeremy Thorpe.
No, of course, I would say Joe Grimmond, my illustrious predecessor, the man who pulled liberalism back to the brink in the 1950s.
I met him once, a fantastic
great man. Still casts a long shadow.
Yeah. Lionel?
One of the reasons I'm a novelist is I don't think on my feet. And I'm going to pass.
Okay.
Jenny Lee or Jo Richardson. I mean, both absolute pioneering Labour women who did just things that lasted forever. They are still with us. The Open University, the Arts Council, that's Jenny Lee, and with Jo Richardson, domestic violence laws, which are incredible and have helped millions of people.
Well, it definitely wouldn't be Ed Balls, that's for sure. I was saying to somebody today, I wouldn't mind seeing David Cameron or perhaps George Osborne back in the Commons.
Well, that still could happen. I think it's more likely in Osborne's case than David Cameron's, but it could happen. You never know. Thank you very much to all of you. Craig Whittaker, Thangam Debbonaire, Lionel Shriver. Plug your book again. What's it called?
Should we stay or should we go?
We're going to go in a minute, but thank you, Alistair Carmichael, as well. Coming up in a moment, we're going to talk about driverless cars. Have you ever heard such a ridiculous proposal? It's going to be in the Highway Code that if you have a driverless car, you're going to be able to watch television in it while you're driving. But you're not going to be able to use your mobile phone. Have you ever heard of anything so preposterous? And would you actually ever consider buying a driverless car? I know my answer. Wonder what yours is. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9:00. Vladimir Putin says the test launch of a new intercontinental ballistic missile will give the West food for thought. The Russian president says it's capable of overcoming all types of anti-missile